Welcome back to Sports Tuesday. I am Steve Manderson, and my featured guest tonight is no stranger to Sports Tuesday. He has been on the show last year, and very interesting gentleman, very interesting what he's involved with. He is the Director of Operations for the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, and which is something I didn't know until last year, but it's very fascinating. And last year we talked about the 2017 inductees, which included the late Roy Halladay. This year we'll be talking about three inductees for 2018, Pedro Martinez, Lloyd Moseby, and Bill Humer. So let me welcome back to Sports Tuesday, Scott Crawford. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic, Steve. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine. I'll tell you, it's a pleasure to have you back. And this year, we are inducting three inductees into the Hall of Fame, Canadian Hall of Fame, which is Pedro Martinez, Lloyd Moseby, and Bill Humer. And I'll tell you, three very prominent, interesting gentlemen who more than made their contributions to baseball, and it's fantastic. Let's talk about right now Pedro Martinez. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2015 and started his career with the Montreal Expos and wound up being a hell of a pitcher, 219 wins in a 18-year career. And what did he mean to the Expos back then when he first started?
He meant a lot. I mean, he was traded for Delino DeShields, who was one of their great second basemen with the Expos, and he was sort of an up-and-coming person. He was small-framed, and most pitchers are larger in stature, and he came quickly over from the Dodgers, and the Dodgers didn't really see him as a starter. They thought he wasn't big enough or strong enough to be a starter, and the Expos obviously did. Felipe Alou, one of our inductees, and from the Dominican Republic as well, like Pedro, really liked what Pedro had, and he went and told Pedro when he got here, "You're my starter. You're one of my 5 starters," and that really caught Pedro off guard when he came to Montreal, because he'd never been a starter before, and he's always told he was too small to be a starter. And but the Expos gave him the shot, and he had 4. His first year with the Expos, he won 11 games. The ERA was 3.4. And he struck out basically a batter per inning. So he got right in there and did a very excellent job.
Yeah, and we're talking about pitchers that you say he was small. The Yankees, I'm a diehard Yankee fan, and the Yankees had a pitcher that was tiny himself and wound up having a great career and a fantastic season in 1978 when he was like 25-3, something like that. We're talking about Ron Guidry. Some of these small pitchers, they pack a lot, and Pedro was small, but he had a great fastball, and he was a dominating pitcher with the teams that he played for, and he had games where, forget about it, the batters just went up, took their cuts, and just went back to the dugout.
For sure. I mean, Pedro is one of the greatest pitchers of our generation. Like you mentioned, he pitched 18 years in the big leagues, and he was 5'11", and they said he was 170 pounds. So I mean, he wasn't that big of a guy, but he could throw it with anyone in the league. I mean, he won 3 Cy Young awards. That just tells you how good he was. One with the Montreal Expos in 1997, and that was really his first breakout year was 97. His ERA was 1.9. He had 13 complete games, over 300 strikeouts. So, I mean, he knew how to dominate the league, and that's why he's in our Hall of Fame and the National Hall of Fame down in Cooperstown.
And one of his teammates in that rotation is another Hall of Famer, Randy Johnson. And it was crazy to have those two guys of that magnitude in the same pitching rotation back then.
It sure would have been. I mean, imagine them standing beside each other. It's like when Jose Altuve stands beside Aaron Judge these days. You know, it's just the little guy and the big guy standing beside each other. Randy Johnson and Pedro Martinez would have been the very same thing. But they're both such dominant. Randy, you know, he was 6'11" or however tall he was, and he had the 100-mile-an-hour fastball from the left side. But Pedro was smaller, but he still had the fastball. I mean, he'd throw it up in the high to mid 90s, and he'd be sneaky quick, and that's one way he'd get his Hall of Fame career off and running.
Now, being that he played for Montreal in the beginning, how was the fans in Montreal receptive of him, and how was he treated?
In the long run, very, very well. I mean, obviously, when they traded him for, like I mentioned, Delino DeShields, who was the starting second baseman and stole lots of bases and played great defense. So it was sort of trading the well-known player for the pitcher no one was sure of what he was going to do. So at the beginning, it wasn't seen as a fantastic trade, but it didn't take long because he stepped right into the Montreal's rotation and pitched well. And Felipe Alou, the manager, loved him, and people loved Alou. And so Montreal fans really fell in love with him. And one thing Pedro says when he was in Montreal is that he loved the city, because the fans, he said everybody was so nice, you know, made him feel safe and loved and warm, and he really enjoyed Montreal. He was only there 4 years, but he said that was 4 of his best years of baseball, because he felt like he belonged and he felt like the people really liked him.
Well, he did do well there in his beginnings. My only thing with him was, when he was a Red Sox, a lot of people will remember that big fight in 2004 with the Yankees, and they showed him pushing down to the ground Don Zimmer, an old man, and I got angry with him. It's like, you didn't have to do that, and a lot of people got on him about it. Some people have forgotten. I just remember knowing what he was, but it doesn't define the kind of person and player that he was. But I remember that that was crazy that particular day.
That was. No, I definitely remember that as well. I mean, it was a sore point in I'm sure his career and Zimmer's career. I mean, obviously Don's was in the game for many decades and had a great long professional career, and it was one of those Yankees versus Red Sox. You know, they have never liked each other in 100 years of baseball, and even till today they're battling it out for first place in the American League East, and that was obviously one of those nights where things weren't going right for either side. I mean, if Pedro and Don Zimmer are having a confrontation, obviously things aren't going right, because those two shouldn't meet up in a ball game very often, and things didn't go well, but Pedro was one of those guys who was hot-tempered. He was pretty strict and pretty stern, and liked to do things his way, and he liked to throw high and tight to people if he needed to, and wouldn't like the hitters show him up if they hit a home run. He sure wouldn't have liked them, tossing the bat around after the home run, and that's just Pedro kept control of his game that way.
That is true. That defines who he was. A lot of people, he wasn't well liked in certain circles, but when it came to pitching, he was lights out. He was one of the best ever, and it was well deserving of his Hall of Fame in Cooperstown and this year in the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. He was one of the best control pitchers that I ever saw. A lot of people, because I rate him right up there with Roger Clemens. Roger Clemens, a former Red Sox himself, and great control.
There's four pitchers in the history of baseball that have more than 3,000 strikeouts and less than 1,000 walks. Two of them are in our Hall of Fame, and three of them are in Cooperstown, with the fourth one maybe joining them. Fergie Jenkins, of course, our greatest Canadian ever. Pedro Martinez, we just talked about. Greg Maddux, the great righty from the Braves.
Oh, yes.
Kurt Schilling, the former Red Sox, Phillies pitcher, and a few other teams, Arizona and whatnot. So you're right about Pedro's great control. There's only four guys in the history of the game that had the same type of control and strikeout power that Pedro did. That puts him in a class of his own.
Yes, it is, and honor well-deserved this year in the Canadian Hall of Fame. Now, let us talk about Lloyd Moseby. Now, I remember this guy. This was back in the day when Toronto had George Bell, Lloyd Moseby, Jesse Barthel. That was a hell of a lineup. And Lloyd Moseby, a lot of people don't talk about him, and I know he's been away from the game for a while now, but I remember this guy can hit. This guy could just flat out hit average hit for power. And what kind of the magnitude that he had for Toronto back then?
Well, I mean, he broke in with the Blue Jays in 1980. He was only 20 years old, and he was a starting center fielder for the Blue Jays at Exhibition Stadium. So, first of all, that tells you not many players can be 20 years old and be the starting center fielder for a major league team. So he had a lot of talent, a lot of speed, and like you mentioned, some power in his at bat as well. And from 1980 to 1989, he was the Jays' starting center fielder. So for a whole decade, again, it doesn't happen very often where you have a center fielder who's the starter for 10 years in a row, especially now with all the trades and free agency and stuff. But Lloyd stuck around. Lloyd was the center of that outfield you'd mentioned about. I mean, it was the best young outfield in all of baseball in the early 80s. Lloyd had his speed, Bell had his power, and Jesse had his defense and power. So it was a great combination for the Blue Jays and a really exciting time for baseball fans in Canada that love the Jays.
That is true. In 1983, he hit .315, 18 homers, got 31 doubles. He was tremendous. He was actually one of the top. He had 11 assists that year, and he led the American League in assists. He could definitely throw runners out. That was for sure. And
that was it. Yes. But he was tremendous. And
when I saw his name come up, and I was saying, wow, a lot of people here in the United States, they don't mention his name like that I would thought. And he was very consistent in his 11-year career, and that was the thing that I was impressed about. Actually, in '84, he had 39 stolen bases, so he had a lot of speed. 15 triples. That was amazing as well.
It was, and he was one of those guys that 4 years in a row he stole 27, 39, 37, 32. Well, let me keep going. 39, 31 stolen bases. So 6 or 7 years, he was one of the fastest guys and best stolen base people in the American League. And like you said, through that power and through the defense he won a Silver Slugger Award. He was an All-Star. A lot of people don't necessarily remember Mosby because he didn't win George Bell won the MVP in 87. Jesse Barfield had that rifle arm and won the home run title in 86 in the American League. And Mosby, didn't win any major awards like that, but he was the center. He had the defense. He always jokes about how George Bell was terrible out in left field, and he always had to shade over towards left to go catch anything because George didn't want to. And so he had a lot of things to do out in the outfield along with hitting the ball.
Yeah, he was right about George Bell in the outfield. He was lazy. he really was. In my opinion, George Bell belonged as a DH because as a fielder, he was just average to me. And Lloyd was right. He picked up the slack for George a lot, which nobody really talked about. But, George was lazy. Plain and simple.
And Lloyd and George always joke about it. Lloyd even joked about it in his induction speech. They're great friends as of today because they grew up as through their 20s with the Blue Jays. And he always jokes how George always said, every ball is yours, Lloyd. I'm not going to get it. And Lloyd knew what it was. George was known for his offense and his home runs and whatnot. And like I mentioned, Lloyd could play both sides of the ball very, very well.
Yes, he did. And during that time, the Blue Jays they did well. They did well. They had great pitching too, and at that time, and they at that they were coached then by at the time it started out with Bobby Cox, coach managing them. He wound up being in the as a GM in the front office, but you can tell the maturation of the organization and leading up to the back-to-back championship seasons in the 90s under Cito Gaston, and but those guys paved the way for Toronto to do what they did, and Lloyd Mosby was a tremendous. I think that if he had played longer, he might have been a candidate for the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And he retired from Major League Baseball at age 31, so that's relatively young. He played a couple years in Japan after that, but his Major League career wound down. He played 12 years, but still at 31 to be retired, it's pretty early. But I agree. If he'd kept going for several more years, someone else had given him a chance. He was with the Tigers his last 2 years, and his last year in the big leagues in 91, he only played part time, but he doubled his numbers. He only played half a game. He had a very successful season, and would have been nice to see him keep playing. But sometimes those opportunities just don't come up for these guys. And he was lucky enough to hook on Japan for a couple of years, and now he does a lot of things for the Jays Care Foundation and the Blue Jays, giving back to kids all the time, helping them coach the kids. So that's fantastic to see him giving back to the youth of the future.
That is true. And I tell you, back then, playing on that surface at the Sky Dome, that wasn't the easiest of surfaces to play on, and it was very hard on your legs, especially your knees.
It was, and with him playing center field, it was a concrete floor with an inch of carpet on it. Running around there every day with your knees and your lower back, and then stealing bases, whatnot. It definitely would have taken a toll on anyone, and so it's no surprising he probably had some injuries creep up to him in his early 30s, and that's what led to his retirement. But he's he's still looking good and doing well and walking straight, and he was very active and happy to be here in St. Mary's.
Yes, he had a tremendous career in a short period of time, and congratulations to him on being inducted this year. Now, the final inductee for this year is a baseball historian in William Humber. And tell us about this gentleman. And reading his bio and everything, this is a very interesting gentleman. Tell us something about William Humber.
Yeah, for sure. He's, there's our selection committee spread across Canada does the voting each year for these guys, and they always like to make sure they cover as many facets of the game as possible. Other years they have we've inducted umpires and executives and announcers and whatnot, and this year they saw the opportunity to induct our first historian, and Bill Humber. He lives just the other side of Toronto, so just a couple hours away. He's a Seneca College professor for many, many years, and he's known as Canada's premier baseball historian. When people come and ask us history questions or information about not only Canadian baseball history but North American baseball history, and sometimes we don't know the answers, but if we don't know the answers, we know that Bill does, and so we call him. So he's more than well deserving to be in our Hall of Fame.
Now, he's wrote many books, and his knowledge of where did it all begin for him?
It was his. He said it was his dad. His dad loved the game of baseball, like a lot of their father-son things. They attach on to the son. What the father loves to do and loves to watch and learn about, and he went to the Toronto Maple Leaf baseball games, International League baseball games in the 50s and 60s down by the lake, and he fell in love with the game, and he always jokes that he loves the history of the game more than the current game, so he won't care too much about games in 2018 until he says for about another 20 years.
Wow, that's
he'll
interesting.
Look back at them and go, yeah, 2018 was a pretty cool year. But he's definitely a historian and a history buff for the game of baseball.
Well, I tell you, I don't blame him for kind of being turned off for the way baseball is today, because I'm getting turned off. You're not enough, too much emphasis on the home runs, and not enough small ball, as they say, the fundamentals. Pitchers are not even going 7, 8 innings anymore. I don't think we'll ever see a 300-game winner anymore. So the way the game is today, it must be killing them.
Yes, because he loves it back in the day when the pitchers would throw a complete game and the players could bunt and hit doubles and triples and run around the bases and play good defense. Where you're right, it's now a game of strikeout or home run, and and pitchers, if they go 5 innings, they've had a good start. Well, I'm sort of like you and Bill. I like I think that the triple is more exciting than a home run, or throwing someone out at the plate. Like how rare is someone from the outfield throwing out a base runner at home plate? I mean, that's just a great, fantastic, exciting play. And home runs.
And I'll tell
nice,
you,
but
when you talk about throwing runners at the plate, they even changed the rule on that, where the catchers are not allowed to block the plate anymore because of that injury to Buster Posey a few years ago. I'm like, are you kidding me? Injuries happen, but that is one of the most exciting parts of the game.
Yep.
I don't get
second
it.
base, you can't run into the second baseman anymore either. When you slide into second, it's just one of those things that, time. It's definitely changed, and is it good? Is it bad? I mean, you'll ask 10 people, you'll get 5 people on each side of the story, but it's one of those things that it's changed, and whether it's good or bad, I don't know.
No, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm a baseball purist like a lot of others, but sometimes certain things. I truly believe if it's not broke, do not fix it. Okay? And I felt a lot of the rules changes that they have should not be, because there's nothing wrong with the game. There's nothing wrong with the game. I'm still having problems with a lot of times these new ballparks. The fences, they keep bringing in the fences all the time. For what? Does that define what a power hit is? Because you can hit a home run over 350 feet? That's minor league dimensions, in my opinion. What are you doing? You know, that's just me. That is just me, though.
It definitely brings conversation to the board table or the lunch table each day. I'm sure in a lot of places, a lot of factories and companies around North America. You're right. They're building smaller ballparks. They like the offense. It was now it's a lot of solo home runs. I mean, and or a lot of strikeouts, and the excitement of the game is making contact and making plays and seeing some defense. And there's a few guys that are obviously very good at defense still, but it's definitely going the way of the launch angle and trying to hit a home runs.
Yeah, it is, and it's just turning me off. And the fact that pitchers don't even go 7, 8 innings, we'll never probably see another. It's going to be rare to see a pitcher go 9 innings anymore, and I don't believe we'll never see another 300-game winner. It's crazy. I mean, I'm not going to knock Pedro. Pedro, in his career, he won 219 games, but in his case, even though the win total was low, the body of work within that 219 wins was tremendous.
Oh, definitely, and I agree. I mean, right now we got CC Sabathia, with 230 or 40 wins. We got Bartolo Colon in Texas with, he's about 245 wins, and maybe I'm missing someone else, but there's not many guys, over 200 wins or at 200 wins, and the Clayton Kershaws of the world and Max Scherzers of the world, and a few of those great pitchers that are creeping up to 200, or close to maybe 150 and 200. They're a long ways off, and you're right. I don't think they're going to get to 300. I think the 300 numbers might drop to the 250 number with these guys as a magical, unofficial number for Cooperstown type stats.
Yes, that is true. It's crazy. Well, I'll tell you this much. Pedro gets into the Hall with 219 wins. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm a diehard Yankee fan. Andy Pettitte should get in, okay? And I agree with you, CC Sabathia should get in, and even Bartolo Colon. This guy's at 45 years old. This guy's got a rubber arm.
I know. He started with he's the last remaining Montreal Expo to be in the big leagues, Bartolo Colon. So we're secretly cheering for him over here in Canada because we want to see that Expo name continue along.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to hear this stuff from the committee talking about, Andy Pettitte's ERA was high. So what? You're totally ignoring what he did in the playoffs. He had 19 playoff wins. 5 of them were World Series wins. Roger Clemens can't claim that. Okay? A lot of the players Clemens is not in the Hall of Fame yet, but a lot of Hall of Fame pitchers can't claim 5 World Series wins.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, Pettitte had 256 wins over his career, and his last year in the big leagues, his ERA is only 3.7, and he hung him up. So I mean, he was still pitching very well. He had 30 starts his last year, and pitching well. He could have kept going, and they do. need to look at the postseason records as well. I mean, like you said, 19 wins and a 3.8 ERA in the playoffs. So that's he pitched another whole season just in the playoffs and more than the season in the playoffs. And that's why I mean that magic number might right now it might be hurting Andy Pettitte a little bit because he's at 256 and people still have that unwritten 300 game winning rule, which is in my mind should be out the window. But it might take a few years for them to realize how magical 256 wins are and over 500 starts, over 3,000 innings pitched. Down the road, I think Andy will benefit from people sort of re-looking at his career and at the career of pitchers who pitched in the 90s and 2000s because they didn't win as many games, they didn't pitch as many innings, so I think down the road Andy might be looked at once again.
That is true. I'll tell you this much: I'm a protest. I'm a diehard Yankee. I got to root for my guys, and Andy was extraordinary, and especially in the playoffs. He has to be considered for the Hall of Fame. This nonsense about, he had a high ERA. I know Hall of Fame pitchers that got ERAs just around there, too, even though they won 300 games, but their ERAs are high. And I don't get it. This Hall of Fame committee, they need to get rid of the old geezers, man, and put in some people that uses common sense. Now, I'm being honest about that because it's nonsense. You're keeping people out of the Hall of Fame for really ignorant reasons. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, and I think they're starting to change that, which, again, I think it'll take a year or two. I mean, the other year they went and they chopped out, 100 or so voters who were retired from the game and didn't really have anything to do with the game anymore, which was fantastic because you're right. They had a whole bunch of people that weren't involved in the game anymore, but still had a vote, and so they got rid of a lot of those people, which is a great thing to do. And I think Andy comes up on the ballot next year, I believe, and we'll see how he does. I mean, it always the superstars of superstars get the first and second year, like Vladimir going in this year and whatnot. But we'll see how what the writers think of him starting next year when he's on the ballot.
No, it's true. If he played for the Expos or the Blue Jays, he'd be in on the first ballot. You know that, right?
Yep.
That is true. Tell us about Tom Cheek. This was an outstanding announcer, play-by-play announcer for the Blue Jays. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, Tom Cheek, passed away way too young back in 2005 from brain cancer, and he was the first Blue Jay announcer. His first game was April 7, 1977, and his last game was June 2nd, 2004. So imagine that.
Wow.
A day of work in 4,306 games. Like, who doesn't miss a day of work in those years and those many days in a row? He was legendary. Or he is legendary. And he's on the Blue Jays level of excellence. He's won our Jack Graney Award for Lifetime Media, and he's been inducted into the Hall of Fame back in 2013. He's the guy. He was the voice of the Blue Jays for all those years, and there's been many voices over the years. Jerry Howarth does it, just retired in spring training this year. And, it was always Tom and Jerry forever, and then Jerry took over as the main voice once Tom passed away, and Jerry did a great job after him as well.
Now, he was born in Florida. He's from Florida, and he went up to Canada and was doing play-by-play for – he actually did for the Montreal and for Toronto, but that is amazing. He must have a hell of a personality.
Yeah, he did the Expos sort of a backup broadcaster for a couple years with Montreal in the mid-'70s, and then when the Blue Jays started, of course, in 1977, and being a new team, obviously they're looking for more full-time people, and he jumped. They obviously liked what he did with the Expos, and brought him in to do the Blue Jays, and he lasted all those years and all those games, and you hear his voice every time they talk about the World Series, because he said, "Touch 'em all, Joe. You'll never hit a bigger home run in your life," and that was Joe Carter's World Series winning home run.
I remember that. That they still played that home run any chance people get. It's one of the great championship endings in baseball history. It goes right up there with Bill Mazeroski, and it was great. Those were those great Blue Jay years, and I could imagine the call from Tom Cheek at that time. And you said that he called pretty much every game from the Blue Jays. He reminds me of the Yankees radio announcer John Sterling, who just last week on the 4th of July celebrated his 80th birthday, and he's called every Yankee game now for about the last 30 years. That is amazing. You talk about dedication and a passion for what you do.
Yes, definitely, and you need that passion. I mean, the sport of baseball, only one team ends up happy at the end of the season, and 29 teams are wondering what went wrong because they didn't win the World Series, and so it can be a lot of lean years. I mean, the Jays were one of the best teams in the American League from '84 to '93, but once '94 hit, the Jays went on a several years of playing bad baseball. And as an announcer, like any team, you gotta fight through it, because you got millions of people listening to you every day, and it's sometimes tough. I mean, the Yankees went through their lean years like every team does. Blue Jays do. Every team has their ups and downs, and as their broadcaster, you gotta keep the fans positive and keep the words positive and try. But it can be tough, because as we know, all our favorite teams have some pretty rough seasons out there.
That is true. Well, a few more questions before I let you go, and I thank you a lot for coming on. The Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame is right now closed for 2018, I guess, is due to you guys are going through a renovation period.
Yeah, we're pretty excited. We've been in St. Mary's since 1998, and we're finally expanding the museum. We started over the winter time, and it's going to take till about a full year project. So we'll be done sometime in the middle of winter, and have our big grand opening in the spring of 2019. But we're adding 2,500 square feet of space, which will allow us to store and archive our vast collection of artifacts properly and in order. So when people call us and say, "Hey, do you have this, and this?" we can easily look it up and tell them yes or no. And it's so important for our collection, because like any museum, like Cooperstown or like the Negro League Hall of Fame, any of them, they want to have their collection in order and keep things for the future, because baseball is all about the past, but if you don't preserve the past, you're going to lose it. So it's very important. And then we have some more display space for people to enjoy the artifacts and really learn a lot about not only Canadian baseball, but I mean about baseball in general, which we do have on display.
Okay, that's great. That is great. The Montreal Expos folded, unfortunately, and became the Washington Nationals, who are hosting the 2018 Major League All-Star Game coming next week on the 17th. Do you see maybe in the near future maybe a possibility of baseball being restored in Montreal, or even maybe another Canadian city? Do you see maybe baseball in Vancouver or Calgary or Quebec? Do you see anything like that developing in Canada?
I do. I think Montreal is a natural spot to go back to. The other cities you mentioned, Vancouver has a single-A team that's doing very well, and they seem to be supporting that enough. Calgary and Quebec City type things, their season would be too short, I think, just because weather-wise. I think Montreal, they need ownership. There's been all kinds of whispers about owners and Charles Bronfman's son, Stephen, wanting to get a team going, and they have a plot of land, and of course they have the money. But I think Major League Baseball, they keep talking, there's stadium issues. Obviously Tampa Bay and I think Oakland stadium issue was fixed, but Major League Baseball, to move a team is pretty big. The Tampa Bay's been around for 20 years, I believe, or maybe over. And and for years people were saying, well, Tampa Bay's struggling. They couldn't even draw fans when they were winning and going to the playoffs several years ago. And but Major League Baseball would have to sort of admit that, whoops, it didn't work in Tampa Bay, and now we're moving a team. I don't think they want to admit that something didn't work and have to move a team. Expansion, they always talk about expansion by 2 teams to keep the schedule even and the teams in each league even. And but Washington, if you look at the history of baseball, this is Washington's 3rd baseball team. So why can't a team go back to Montreal? It'd be their 2nd shot at it. If they're going to give Washington 3 shots at it, why not give Montreal a 2nd shot to see if they can to make it work? And lots of other cities have had teams that have left and come back. So I surely hope they do. I think it's a long process still, and I don't think it's a couple of years away. If it's going to happen, it's going to be several years away. But as long as there's keeps open conversation and positive talk between the commissioner's office and the people in Montreal, then that's a great step, and that's the first step that's needed.
I agree, and we'll hope so, because I remember back then the fans in Montreal were very good, very receptive, very supportive of their organization. It's just like what Toronto is now, and they're still going strong after all these years. And so I believe that it can happen again for Montreal. And last question, if you can talk about it, who are the candidates for the Canadian Hall of Fame for 2019, if you can speak on it?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit, of course, but obviously the voting committee does their work in December and January, and then we announce in February. To be nominated for our Hall of Fame, first of all, someone has to actually nominate you. It's not like Cooperstown where you're on the ballot after 5 years. So a lot of people wonder why this person and that person aren't in our Hall of Fame, and it's because they've never been nominated. So that's one of the first steps for a process. But guys, you have to be retired 3 years from the game. So if you think of some Canadians who retired within the last couple of years, you have Jason Bay from British Columbia, who played with the Mets and the Red Sox and the Pirates, and got Ryan Dempster, who pitched for the Cubs and the Marlins and the Reds. There's a few Blue Jays like Vernon Wells or Jimmy Key, or and then there's always those guys that no one really thinks of until they see their nomination package. Like no one really had Bill Humber on their mind until his package was put together, and people went, wow, he's the best in Canada, and he should be in our Hall of Fame, and the committee talked about it and voted him in. So that was great to see. So there's always some surprise names out there. And then there's, those obvious Canadians that had fantastic careers. A couple years down the road, of course, Justin Morneau will be in the Hall of Fame. He just retired this season, so again, he's got a couple more years to wait. But they'll get in, and every year is always a great year and an interesting class of inductees.
And one more, we just recently, the baseball world took a major hit with the loss of LeGrand Orange Rusty Staub. passing away. And how did the people up in Montreal, I know they were devastated. Your feelings on the passing of Steve?
He was one of the first superstars in Montreal history. He came over in '69, the first year of the franchise, and he became a favorite. I mean, he had the orangish red hair. That's how he got his nickname, and he went out and he learned French, which of course is the other national language here in Canada, and that really took to the Montreal fans. They loved it that he went out and he tried to relate with the fans, relate with the people. He'd always go and do events. He'd sign autographs. He'd take pictures. He'd talk to the fans in French, and that's what really made him popular. And he was a great player. I mean, he's the only player in baseball history to have 500 hits with 4 different teams, including the Mets there in New York, Houston, the Tigers, and the Expos. So you look at his career, and he played almost 3,000 baseball games. I think he's played the most games out of anyone who's not in the Hall of Fame down in Cooperstown, other than Rafael Palmeiro, actually. So and he's got his past he has to deal with. Rafael does, but Rusty was a great player. It was a very sad day. We lost 4 inductees in about a 6-month span, including Roy Halladay that you mentioned, and
yes,
Wayne Norton and Ron Hader. And it's so great. When I saw the Mets were going to wear the Rusty Staub patch on their jersey all year, that was so touching, and that just shows how much Rusty meant to the Mets and to the New York community. He was still giving back to the communities and the firefighters of New York City, and doing all kinds of great things in the city of New York. And the Mets are honoring him this year by wearing his name on their jersey, which is fantastic.
It is. He was a great player, a great man, a great humanitarian, and he will be missed by all. God rest his soul. Now, on that note, we are out of time, but Scott, this was great. I thank you once again for coming on the show. You know you are welcome anytime. In fact, you know what? Next year, we'll talk about the 2019 inductees. So you know you're coming back.
Excellent. Well, I can't wait. Just let me know anytime, Steve, and I'll be glad to chat with you.
You got it. So listen, until next time, you take care, and God bless, and looking forward to that. I know the fans in Canada are looking forward to the reopening of the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. So that'll be great.
Perfect. Me too. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Take care. God bless.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Source Nation, the Director of Operations at the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, Scott Crawford. And I tell you, baseball in Canada, it continues to be very popular, and I hope that baseball resurfaces again, professional baseball resurfaces again in Montreal. So we'll see what happens. So that's it. All right. So that is it for me. And until next week, everybody, as I always say, take care, be good, and be safe. Take care, everybody.